So welcome. Hi, everyone on Facebook. With a little bit of a delay, but let me start. So cześć, sziasztok, and welcome to the discussion about LGBT activism in Poland and Hungary. This meeting is organized by Pracownia Etnograficzna, or the Ethnographic Laboratory Association, and the Duży Pokój Gallery, in partnership with the Institute of Ethnology and Cultural Anthropology at the University of Warsaw. So thank you for the organizers for having us here. Little intro to the topic. In the past few years, both Poland and Hungary have been making headlines as the most homophobic countries in the EU. And news about prosecuting young queer activists for putting rainbow flags on monuments in Warsaw, or about publicly shredding non-discriminatory children's books in Budapest, about banning gender studies programs and establishing the infamous LGBT-free zones, paint a rather grim picture of the current state of affairs in Poland and Hungary. Both countries share state socialist past and are under well-allied conservative governments presently. So today we have invited scholars and activists to reflect on the recent challenges for the LGBT communities in those two countries and on the developments within the queer social movements. It is my honor to introduce our guest today. I will start with Maria Dębińska, who is assistant professor at the Institute of Archaeology and Ethnology in the Polish Academy of Sciences. She received her PhD in anthropology from the Warsaw University for a thesis on the topic of legal, medical, and social contexts of the emergence of transgender subjectivities in Poland. And she has published this work as a monograph that you can read in Polish. She has also published more on sexology and diagnosing transsexualism in the medical discourses in state socialist Poland. In the years 2013 and 2014, she has been a visiting researcher at the Gender Studies Department of the Central European University in Budapest, funded by the Visegrad Fund Scholarship. And presently, she is a principal investigator in the research grant funded by the Polish National Science Center on slime mold as method, ethnography of scientific practice. Hi, Marysia. Nice to see you again.
Hi, nice to see you too.
Next one on the agenda is Dorotia Redaj, who is an independent scholar working in the field of gender, sexuality, and education in Hungary. She currently is a research fellow at CEU Democracy Institute in Budapest. She has a PhD in gender studies from Central European University in Budapest. Her research interests include gender equality in education, sex education, the intersectional reproduction of social inequalities in education, and anti-gender education politics in Central Eastern Europe. You can read more about her work in her monograph, Exploring Sexuality in Schools, the Intersectional Reproduction of Inequality, that was published in 2019 by Palgrave Macmillan. And besides her research and training work, she has done some tremendous work as an activist in the Labris Lesbian Association in Budapest. And she is the coordinator of the Fairyland is for Everyone book project that I hope we will hear a little bit more about during the discussion as well. And also she has recently received the Emma Goldman Snowball Award for her feminist and academic work. Hi, Dori.
Hi. Thanks for the introduction.
Super. Then we also have Hadley Rankin, who received his PhD in anthropology from the University of Michigan in 2007. And he has been teaching and mentoring at the Gender Studies Department at Central European University, first in Budapest in Hungary and now in Vienna in Austria since 2009. His research has focused on Hungarian sexual politics, particularly those of Hungary's LGBTQI movements, and the complexities of the relationships between sexuality and transnational and national belongings in post-socialist contexts. He's also interested in the historical intersections between sexuality and geotemporality in the changing orientational politics of Europe's East. And he has written on Hungarian sexual politics, post-socialist homophobias, Eastern European histories of sexual science, and the disconnections and connections between anthropological and queer theories. So Hadley, great to have you here.
Thanks, Mariana.
And last but not least, our guest is also Justyna Struzik, who is a sociologist and social researcher affiliated with the Institute of Sociology at the Jagiellonian University in Krakow. She has conducted research on queer activism in Poland and on the history of HIV and AIDS policies. As part of the activities of the Women's Space Foundation, she co-led innovative research on the social situation of non-heterosexual women living outside big cities. She currently works on harm reduction and drug policies and wonders why there's almost no drug user movement in Poland. And Justyna's list of publication is really impressive, but let me just mention her two most recent monographs that are about queer solidarity, mobilization, and social and queer movements in Poland, and a co-edited work about rainbow families of choice in Poland. So welcome, Justyna.
Hello, very nice to see you all.
And my name is Marianna Szczygielska. I will moderate this discussion today. I'm a gender studies scholar and a queer feminist activist. I received my PhD in comparative gender studies from the Central European University, still in Budapest. And my research focuses mostly on environmental humanities and feminist science and technology studies. I'm currently a postdoctoral fellow at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in Berlin. I'm really happy to lead this discussion, partly because I've shared my adult life between Hungary and Poland. I was part of the Radical Queer Affinity Collective in Budapest. I also worked for the campaign against homophobia in Warsaw. And it's my honor to convene a panel discussion with my friends, colleagues, and mentors. So a little bit about the logistics today. The discussion will take place about 1 hour, and then we will open the floor for the audience to ask questions. But I actually encourage you to already write your questions and comments on Facebook, and those will be communicated to us. So when you listen to us, please already try to engage. And I guess we're ready to start. First, we need a small recap of the recent events in both countries. So could you please tell us briefly about how the legal and political situation of LGBT persons have changed in the last few years in Hungary and in Poland? And since we have two people talking about Hungary and two people talking about Poland, let's start with Hungary. So I will ask Dori to start, Hadley to follow, and then we will move on to Poland. So Dori, the floor is yours now.
Okay, thank you. If we talk about the past year, I would say that things started to change radically for about 2 years, but the whole process started in 2010. So legislation change started, for example, redefining the family, putting a ban on same-sex marriage in the constitution, and so on. So there were like these gradual withdrawals of rights, but public discourse, homophobic public discourse became like larger than life about 2 years ago, and it's been going on since then. That's when politicians started to conflate pedophilia and homosexuality, and now the latest discourse is child protection, so that LGBT people are endangering children, and the government has to protect children. That's why they are introducing various legislations. The first I mentioned that there were new laws since 2010, but in last year, they banned gender recognition for trans people, and then in spring, and then in the autumn, soon after our fairy tale book, which I'll talk about later, was published, they took away the possibility from same-sex couples to adopt children. And then this summer came the so-called pedophilia law, which we don't call pedophilia law because it's not really about pedophilia, it's about homophobia, homo and transphobia. And so that this law bans the depiction and promotion of homosexuality and transsexuality and gender change in education, in schools, and in the media for children under 18. So for children. And and now more recent, this is a very vague law, so like nobody knows how to interpret it. So lately they started to introduce decrees which specify the content of this law, and the first one is to kind of reduce the availability of books containing LGBT topics and characters. Now we have to wrap up into plastic closed packaging. We have to wrap up these books, namely our book, obviously. And there's another one which was published this spring, which is a book for kindergarten children with images of two same-sex families. So all this legislation is practically about two books. And so they have to be closely packaged now, and they cannot be put in shop windows and cannot be sold within 200 meters of churches and schools. And we expect that more will follow. The other thing that this affects is sex education programs run by NGOs which visit schools, including our program called Getting to Know LGBT People, which Labris and Symposium, another organization, has been running since 2000. And the government will put together a list of organizations that schools can invite. And we have no doubt we will not be included there. And so we so-called promote homosexuality and transsexuality in our program. Maybe if Hedley wants something to add.
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Dori. I mean, I think you mentioned most of the things that I would mention. I guess, since you listed many of them, I would just note that I agree very much with Dori that this process has been going on since at least 2010. And really, I think you could argue that it's been a part of a certain side of Hungarian politics since the late 90s, and a part of Fidesz's politics, or the political party of Prime Minister Viktor Orbán. But I think it's really clear, as Dori said, that in the last few years, there's been, especially since 2010, there's been a new consolidation, a new intensification of what I like to call heteronationalism, which includes a kind of reproductive nationalism and a sort of fetishism of traditional families and children. And this has involved new targets and new laws and new forms of propaganda. And so it kind of started out most visibly soon after 2010 with Fidesz's rewriting of the constitution in 2012, which really explicitly defined marriage and family as heterosexual institutions. And in the wake of that, there's been a whole system of pro-natalist state policies, which have symbolically and financially rewarded heterosexual reproductions of grants and loans and tax rebates for more hetero families with babies. But along with that, and in the last few years, there have been a number of these things. I would just add to what Dori said, the 2018 erasure of gender studies from the state's list of officially accredited academic disciplines, because I think that very much goes along with these things. Again, this crackdown on adoption by queer parents, and the closing, the making explicitly illegal something that had been available through other venues, the adoption of children by single parents, and then the adoption by partners, which is now explicitly illegal. The law against transgender and intersex people legally changing assigned birth gender, which happened in 2020. 2020 also featured the repudiation and finally of the Istanbul Convention, which of course the Hungarian government had been sort of playing around with and stalling for years. And then this law, which is against media representations. And I would just note that one, I think it's important, but not an exhaustive explanation, that this is a law that is in many ways modeled on the notorious Russian 2013 anti-gay propaganda law. But also that all of these laws have been justified by the government as necessary for the protection of the nation's children and the nation's future. And so there's this very complicated swirl of policies that target perceived gender transgression, perceived forms of sexuality and parenting and relationships that are perceived to be problematic for the nation and its future. So I think this is really important, but it has been very quick and very fast. And it just is, it's growing in strength. So really distressing. I guess that's it for now.
Yes, so let's now go to painting the political and legal landscape in Poland. And I would ask Justyna to maybe start and then Marcia to follow.
Yeah, thank you. Well, and I was thinking before the meeting about all these past events that happened on political or legal or social level. For me, it was very hard actually, to name or to list of all of these events or of this, steps or shifts, because of the fact that I, as a sociologist, but also as an activist, as a citizen, whatever, I have this feeling since maybe last few years that there are so many things going on right now in Poland that, naming all of this could be a bit difficult. So for me, as a researcher of social movements, the most visible and important change in recent years, it's actually about activism. It's actually about, we will talk about that probably later on in more detail, but for me, this is the most important and inspiring in a way that recently we can observe, this massive protest demonstrations on streets, both in regards to reproductive rights, but of course also regarding LGBT plus issues. And what I would say is important for me when I think about the recent period, or the law and justice government period, is actually something that we can call state homophobia. I think that state homophobia was always somewhere there. There were some politicians, some people from government, even during the so-called liberal government before law and justice. Of course, they were there. But right now, I think that this state homophobia, transphobia, queerphobia is expressed in much more direct way. It's supported by, it's maybe not supported, but it's disseminated through the state institutions, through the local authorities, local governments, for example, by building or creating or announcing this LGBT-free free zones in so many local cities or communities. So of course, I'm telling about this shift or this change when we talk about this state queer homophobia, because I think that this is something very important, because it actually changes radically the relations between the state and the citizens, queer citizens. They were, of course, never easy in Poland, but right now, what the government, what the public institutions, state institutions are saying to to the citizens, they say you are very much not welcome here, and they are saying that every year, every moment actually. So, for example, last year during the presidential campaign, our current president, Andrzej Duda, was saying a lot about LGBT ideology, which become like this, new, a very important notion to describe nobody knows what exactly, but definitely not LGBT community. But back to maybe activism, just to start from this perspective. I think that, when you think about activism in recent years, I would say that even before the pandemic, I had this feeling that there is this certain queer fatigue in Poland. The people were fighting for so many years on streets, but also through like NGOs work, through some petitions, through some, legal steps, whatever. Nothing worked. Of course, there were some changes, maybe some progress, maybe some regress. Anyway, but nothing worked. And I remember that I was actually thinking about that at the beginning of the pandemic, because I had some classes with my students, and we were talking about basically activism and social movements during the pandemic, right? So we were searching for some new forms of mobilization. We were searching for some new forms of activism. And we were talking about, about feminist movements or an anti-abortion movement under the pandemic and so on. And then we were talking about queer activism, and it was before the huge queer protests. And many of my students and also me, we agreed that, that there is, we don't know how to call it, but maybe it's like this way of, being stuck somewhere in a place, and we don't know how to move as an activist, what to do actually in the current situation. And our diagnosis back then was very, very pessimistic and sad. So basically, our final thought was that we don't know what will happen, but probably it won't be anything positive when it comes to activism. And then there was this huge change in summer in, 2020, right? Because it's always problem of years when we think about protests. So it was in 2020 when we could observe this huge queer protests, not only in Warsaw, but also in Krakow, in other cities, but also many, face-to-face actions, like, this a bit different activism proposed by, Stop Sturom, for example, and so on. So this is something for me that, as a researcher of social movement, but also as an activist, this is something that I would like to start when we think about the recent years. That this is maybe, I don't want to say that this is optimistic or anything like this, because I'm not naive, but this is something like, that actually, this is amazing for me that now in 2020, in 2020, 2021, we can observe this new shift in queer activism in Poland. And of course, it is related with the political steps, right? With LGBT-free zones, with the state homophobia or the state queerphobia. Yeah. So that's from me for now. Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Justyna. And now over to Maria. And when Dori was mentioning and Hadley, how the situation, for example, of trans people in Hungary has changed with the inability to change your legal status so easily. If we had this conversation a couple of years ago and you would compare different countries in Central Eastern Europe, usually people were really surprised that in Hungary, the laws are actually not so bad for trans people. And then suddenly this radical shift happened. And I wonder, Marysia, if you could tell us a bit more about how does this look in Poland? How much has changed in that domain?
Well, I think that Justyna spoke more about activism, so I will focus on the legal and political dimensions. And I think that there are several levels to the political and legal dimension, because when you look at the state level, at the parliamentary level, there's a stalemate, and there has been a stalemate for many, many years. Like the LGBT organizations or liberal parties are not able to do anything to introduce more progressive or LGBT-friendly policies. And the most successful of those, it's a number of failures, right? And one of the most successful failures so far was the bill that was supposed to legally regulate the situation of transgender persons and to make legal gender reassignment really easy and stress-free. And it was even passed by the parliament, surprisingly, after activists worked for 4 years to convince everybody to write the bill and to build support among the members of the parliament, but it was vetoed by the current president in 2015, and the veto was not rejected by the parliament because they were scared, like the liberal side was scared of the upcoming elections, and they were scared of losing the elections, which they did anyway. So it's always the fear on the liberal side, and it's always some kind of incompetence and also failure on the right-wing side, because when you think about it, they haven't been able to pass these laws that have been passed in Hungary, even though they have the same legal organizations like Ordo Juris. This is the same like transnational network of super right-wing organizations that are funded, by Putin and who knows who else. And these are the same, like the copies of those bills, right? This is the same legislation being passed in Russia or in Hungary, or there have been attempts in Poland, but they also failed because the right-wing side on the parliamentary level, on the state level, is too weak to have them pass. And I think it's very telling that the only legal change that was passed in recent years was not done by the parliament, but by the Constitutional Tribunal, right? Which is controlled by the Law and Justice Party, because this was the only way to introduce this abortion ban, which caused huge protests. And I think it's kind of consolidated opposition against the Law and Justice Party, and politically for them, it was also a failure, I think. So on the state level, nothing is happening. There is just propaganda and hate speech and inciting hatred and hateful incidents, which is very, obviously, it's very hurtful and it's very dangerous, and it's not like they don't have any tools to make the lives of LGBT persons worse. But I think what's more interesting is what's happening on the local level, because the LGBT-free zones were a reaction actually to very progressive legislation introduced on the municipal level in Warsaw and in some other bigger cities, because some LGBT organizations like Miłość Nie Wyklucza, in coalition with some others, convinced the current president of Warsaw, Rafał Trzaskowski, to sign the LGBT plus chart, which is like a political promise for the LGBT community to improve municipal policies to make their lives easier in terms of access to sexual education, in terms of building a hostel for homeless persons that have been thrown out of their homes because of being LGBT, and so on. So this was a very, very progressive, I don't like this word, but it's a, I don't believe in progress, but I will use it just as a shorthand for, more LGBT friendly. Okay. So, the LGBT-free zones were a reaction to this, because this LGBT chart was then passed in some other cities, like, as far as I remember, Krakow and Wrocław, and probably also Gdańsk, in several bigger cities. So smaller cities started to pass those LGBT-free zones, which are actually called charts for protecting the family or something. And when talking about queer activism, I also think that the fact that the Law and Justice Party has been using hatred against refugees and LGBT people to build their political support has been met from the start with opposition. And I think, yes, obviously last year in 2020, there was this surge in protests, but it is during the Law and Justice rule that many more cities have been hosting the marches, like LGBT pride marches or marches for equality, they are usually called. Before 2015, when they came to power, they were just organized in several big cities. And now it's more than 20 cities every year that are organizing those marches. So there is huge opposition to those policies. And I think we shouldn't underestimate the hate campaign that is going on, which is really scary, but like seriously very scary. But I don't think they have real political power. And I think that they're in contrast to what's going on in Hungary, the only tool they have is this propaganda. Because they don't have the political power to actually pass any legislation that would strip LGBT persons from their rights, those rights that they still have, right? Because there's no right to marriage, or there's no right to legal gender reassignment that is not humiliating and humiliating. So that's what I have to say.
Justyna.
I mean, I just have maybe two thoughts that I would like to somehow. Oh, I'm sorry, I need to open the door for my cat. Just 1 second. Okay, so because I mean, I agree with Maria very much. But at the same time, I'm thinking about the small steps that small steps, legal steps that are introduced by the government, and they are not that visible. And this is something that I think that we should be maybe more aware, or at least discuss more in Poland. So, for example, I'm thinking about this change, which basically was not discussed in media or even only in some LGBT organizations, I guess. This is the change about the criminal code that happened in 2020 as a part of so-called anti-crisis shield. Because of the pandemic, the government introduced this shield to protect the nation, the population, the society, and they actually introduced some changes in the criminal code. So the change was about exposure to HIV transmission, and they increased sentencing from 3 to 8 years for this. And this is actually a huge change. So one could ask, and we are actually constantly discussing about that with my friend Agata Dziuban. What was the reason for that? I mean, what was the reason for that in 2020, right? When basically, all of these important organizations, international organizations, but also doctors, lawyers, and so on, they say that there is no sense in criminalizing HIV transmission. So our guess and our hypothesis is that this is because of the homophobia. This is because still in public imaginary, HIV is somehow linked with the gay community, of course. And it doesn't make sense. I mean, it simply doesn't make sense. It was the law about the COVID-19, but they did it and it was totally unnoticed. I mean, there was no discussion about that. So I think that this is also important to look at the small steps that are not that visible, but they are being introduced, and they might have important influence. And the second thought was about, that this is also very interesting, that there was, in fact, this Karta Równości in Warsaw that Maria mentioned, this, LGBT-friendly regulation to support LGBT residents in Warsaw. And at the same time, we have these LGBT-free zones in rather small communities. So, you know, that there is this, so what we see, what we observe, that there is this tension being built between these big, progressive, liberal cities, and at the same time, the small cities a bit backward, you know, not from our reality. This is very dangerous for me also. Like, yeah. So this is only some small points. Sorry. Yeah.
No, thank you so much. And I think Dori also wanted to ask about follow-up. And I think we should already move to discussing the activism issues and how activism has changed in relation to those developments that you have described. And we already heard some things about Poland, so it would be great to hear what's going on in Hungary.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I just wanted to make a short note that it's an interesting parallel with what Justina was talking about, that in the first wave, when the government announced an emergency state so that the government can rule by decree, on the next day, they introduced this, what we call a salad law. So there are all sorts of things presented in one law, in one bill. And that law included this part about banning the gender change of trans people. And, you know, like nobody understood, like, what does it have to do with COVID defense, you know? And it's interesting how these legislative tools are used for introducing, you know, homophobic legislation. So that's just what I wanted to note. And so the question is about, question was about activism. One of you, I'm not sure, Justina or Maria, you also mentioned earlier how exhausted activists are, so that there is this fatigue. This is also true in Hungary, because there are so few activists and, you know, so little movement and so limited resources, and everyone is trying to have a life, you know, and so on. And you have to work as well. But since last year, when all these highly discriminatory legislation started, we entered into a sort of coalition with other LGBT organizations and with legal advocacy organizations like Amnesty and Helsinki Committee and TASZ, which is a similar Hungarian one, which was new, because before that it was only like occasional collaboration and occasional alliances, but we have started to work together in a more like permanent basis, especially when the homophobia law was introduced in this summer. Since then, it's been a strengthening coalition. So that's something new. But it's a very small movement. We are also trying to involve feminist organizations, but that has been a challenge, because we have debates about trans issues with some of them. Or it's not really a debate, actually, just different approaches which cannot be somehow, cannot reach an agreement which would be constructive for, but anyway, that's another
You're a diplomat,
question.
Dori.
Yeah, I'm trying to. Yeah, so I don't know what it will look like if we look back in some years. Of course, this new legislation, and as Hedley mentioned, it's coming very fast. So like you have to be there all the time. And really, I mean, this summer was just insane, like constantly, first the law was introduced, then the journalists were like after us all summer, including the whole international media, and it was just, and then this packaging law came just when we were trying to reprint the fourth edition of the book, and then we had to stop it to figure out how to package it or what to do, you know. So it's like constantly something is happening, and that's very exhausting. But I noticed that so getting together in a coalition has also been energizing, because we can divide tasks better, you know, like, so the lawyers should deal with the legal issues and we should deal with, so everyone should deal with what we are good at or what we have expertise in. So there has been some energy in it, which wasn't there before. Yeah.
Dori, actually, I actually think it's a good moment to introduce the book project, because maybe some of the people who are listening to us don't know what is it all about.
Yeah,
so would you like to say briefly, and yeah, if you could show us and promote some homosexuality and transgenderism to our viewers, that would be just fantastic.
Yeah, okay. So this is the book. It's called Fairyland is for Everyone. Would be a good English translation. And the reason why it's important for you to see it is because it's going to be published in Polish probably in November. So, and in 7 other European languages as well. But I really wonder what will happen in Poland if this book comes out. So it would be interesting to keep in touch, because I believe that there will be like enormous scandals. So yeah, so this is a book which contains it's part of our education project, you know, education program. We were thinking like, yeah, we should also address smaller children, because our school program has focused on mainly secondary schools so far, but because in society there, you know, there's so much more hatred and it's growing, and politicians incite all these like hatred and discrimination. So we should bring in some topics and address smaller children. And how can you best address smaller children? By fairy tales. And this is a collection of 17 fairy tales, some of them written by famous authors, others written by beginners or not so well-known authors. It was intentional to collate it like this, and it was immediately branded as an LGBT book. It is not. I think about 5 of the 17 tales contain LGBT characters. Others contain, all of them are feminist tales in a way. And there are other issues in it which are kind of taboo or like important social issues, like, I don't know, child adoption and partner violence and child neglect. So there are all sorts of topics that, or death of a parent, you know, so all sorts of topics that may be difficult for parents to address with children, or for teachers to address with children, and this can help. So that was the idea. And so we published it in like, you know, 1,500 copies, thinking that, yeah, well, maybe we can sell it in a few years. And it just exploded. You mentioned, Mariana, in your introduction, the book shredding performance by a far-right parliamentary party, actually it is. And one of their members tore the book apart and put it through a book shredder. This was a media performance, and a lot of people were shocked. So this gave enormous popularity of the book. I would like to believe that this is also because it's a good book, but but she really helped raise popular interest in the book, and so it became a bestseller. We have sold over 30,000 copies by now, which is really a record in the Hungarian children's book market. And international publishers approached us, so it's going to come out in 8 languages, including English. They bought the whole world rights, you know, so like, who knows what's next. And but it's yeah, I mean, it has obviously occupied most of our activist resources, because there's been so much work with this book. Like, something's always happening, so it's really exhausting. But at the same time, what's important about it that it clearly became a symbol for protesting the government and all this hatred and all these discriminatory politics, and people who wouldn't really express their opinion on these issues. They just went and buy the book and did small actions. Like, for example, there were some bookstores where some extremists went and they assaulted the shop assistants, and then people went there and brought them chocolates and try to take care of them emotionally. So that kind of thing. A lot of all sorts of initiations happened in in protection of the book, or in support of the book. So it's been really it's a bit like a fairy tale, that we are like fighting a dragon, and then we cut its head off, and then 3 new heads grow up, and then you cut that as well, and then new heads again. So it's I don't know where, I don't see where the end of this will be, but we are fighting.
Wait, who's the dragon in this story? Are we the dragon?
Yeah, because it works both ways, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because they try to cut your head off and more grow, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
I'm really looking forward to what's going to happen when we will have the Polish translation of the book. We actually, in Poland, we have several books for children with actually LGBT topics. So there's a translation of the famous book about the gay penguins in the New York City Zoo, about Roy and Tango, and Roy and Silo, and Tango makes 3. But we also have our own Polish publication that is about a snail, Sam, who, as we know, snails have no gender and they're actually intersex. So it's about an intersex snail. And when it came out, I don't remember if there were such big protests as we could observe in Hungary, but I wonder what now will happen when this Hungarian book is going to arrive to the Polish market. But over to Hadley. So we had some great examples of like the recent initiatives, and you have been researching the Hungarian activist movement for some time. How do you see the change happening throughout the years, and what are, in your opinion, kind of the developments and trends, maybe?
Well, that's a big question,
I can ask you
right? But sort of what I'm thinking of is playing or following on what Maria, you were saying about how when the state at national state level is having trouble doing things, often what right-wing movements do is they sort of develop a more diffuse approach. This is certainly what happened in the United States, where the right wing really went kind of underground, not underground, but to the local level, and built up enormous strength, which was then able to affect terrible things at the national level. And I think that, I'm not saying that that's exactly what's happening here, but there is a similarity, I think, or an interplay between, what conservative or right wing or heteronational or homophobic forces try to do on the state level, and what they try to do in this more diffuse way, locally, or through what people might, think of as a kind of cultural politics, right? Developing, education of their own and church programs and things like that. But of course, the same thing happens with activists who try to affect legislation and visible official public politics, but also who develop, cultural means of reaching people, like these programs Dori is talking about, right, which go out to schools and try to educate people, or things like this book, Fairyland is for Everyone, which, try to affect change in a really different way. And I think it's important to realize that both of these are going on. And so on the one hand, we can see certain successes, the right wing on certain levels, but we can see certain really strong resistant responses on the part of queer activists on other levels. So that's one thing I wanted to say. And I think, there's actually been kind of a give and take, if I'm thinking of the longue durée of Hungarian sexual, queer politics. That's been a pattern all through. One other thing to note maybe is that I think, Dori, some of the things you were saying about what Fairyland is for everyone is like the fact that, it gets presented as this LGBT gay-friendly book, but in fact, it's got all of this other stuff in it, about questions of race and ability. I think that this can perhaps tell us the way in which, one particular identity category like LGBTQ plus, whatever, queer, gets sort of tagged as the figure of a wide range of differences that certain people, and let's just say for the moment, conservative nationalist people, might think of as progressive in the sense that I know you don't mean, Maria, right? But they do, right? People they think of as their enemies. The forces of liberalism in the liberal West. And perhaps this gets at some of these questions of why this is happening to LGBT people, why LGBT people become such common, visible targets of the right wing. And it's perhaps because, of activist efforts like this, which kind of try to represent like a broad acceptance of difference as a possibility in a family or a society. And that, of course, is precisely what traditionalist, heteronationalist forces are trying to prevent, right? That's what they're trying to foreclose. So that's one thing. And then I just wanted to kind of affirm what a number of people have said, which is that there's actually been a lot of really inspiring responses besides despair to what's been happening. I mean, of course, there's been despair and there's been burnout and this kind of queer fatigue, right? But there has also been kind of a surge of radicalism and energy in response. And I think this includes things like Fairyland is for Everyone. It also includes sort of a more emphasis, more attention, I think, speaking in Hungary, about Hungary, more attention from kind of traditionally more mainstream lesbian and gay focused groups and NGOs on things like trans issues or questions of race even. New alliances and coalitions cross traditional categories of identity politics. So more connections between Roma and queer and homeless people. And some of this has started earlier. Like I think some of it started to emerge in, following the attacks on Pride in the late 2000s. But more of it started coming out after 2010 when Fidesz's politics became more clear. And I think it's really accelerated now. And it has spread out to this kind of a sense on the part of many people, like these people Dori are describing who, bring chocolates to the shopkeeper or who buy the book because they may not care about gay people, but they see this as kind of a symbol of broader politics. And people responding to these. And I know this year, for example, a lot of people who would not otherwise have come to Budapest Pride came to Budapest Pride because of this whole scandal. And I just heard this kind of, I'm paraphrasing something somebody told me about what their brother said, which is that this year, so this last summer, it's the responsibility of every, good civilized person to come to Pride, right? And of course, we all know, we've heard this a million times, and that same argument should make you come to Pride every year. But there were a lot of people at Budapest Pride this year.
Super, thank you. And because there's so many overlaps, but what are some of the parallels that you see between, the Hungarian and the Polish situation, and both in what's happening on the, governmental, legislative level, but also in activism? But Maria, you had your hand up. Please go ahead.
Yeah, when I was listening to Hadley, I was thinking about the situation in Poland and the parallels with, with all those things that are happening around LGBT activism right now, that it has become more intersectional, that it has gained recognition in the liberal circles that used to be homophobic, just not in a very open and aggressive way. And now it's not cool to be homophobic if you want to be perceived as liberal. And that there are rainbow flags at many protests that have nothing to do with LGBT causes, but obviously might have to do with LGBT persons, like protests against evictions or protests like all the refugee protests that are going on right now. And I think to comment on what Justyna was saying, that this hateful propaganda and this polarization is happening along the lines of big cities versus small towns, and that it is leading to political polarization. I think there are many other lines that along which this process is happening, and these are gender lines for sure. Yeah, I think gender might be one of the biggest factors, but another one is the line of age. Young people are much less homophobic, and they don't really care. I'm not saying all of them, because obviously the gender line is crossing the age line, right? And young men are more homophobic than young women, but on the average, they are less homophobic than older persons. So there are many of those lines are becoming clearer, and I agree that it's not. It's kind of scary because, for example, this gender divide in Poland is kind of scary when you look at the political preferences of men and women and how much they diverge. It's like a gender war, you know. When you look at statistics, it's like two different nations. But this is the scary part. But I think the hopeful part is the intersectionality and the recognition that all struggles are connected, right? And the fact that when I went, there was this, you've heard, this refugee situation, 32 people stuck at the Polish-Belarusian border. And the people who went there, I went there just for a day, but I met there ecologists, people who were fighting to protect Puszcza Białowieska in 2016, and kids from Queer Tour, which is like a new organization of very young people who are traveling around Poland with informational materials about LGBTQ issues. So they go to small towns and cities and bigger cities, and they just put their stall with some leaflets and rainbow flags and pins, and talk to people and to local LGBT activists about queer issues. So these were the two groups that I saw that came to support the refugees, right? So so there are hopeful sides to this situation, but still I would not forget about the disparity when it comes to resources. You know, we don't have the money that they have, and we don't have the police, and we don't have the institutions. So I know that many people are very hopeful, and like when you see those mobilizations, it gives you hope, right? And it gives you the feeling of connection. But I think that's not really enough. I'm a materialist. I think when you don't have the resources, the money, and the institutions, there's not much you can really do. Okay.
Thank you so much. Justyna has her hand up. We actually, I would like to also remind the people who are listening to us that you can already type in your questions and they will be passed on to us. So don't be shy and already write something in the comments section. But yes, coming back to the discussion, there are these new initiatives that are really springing up, like this metaphorical, dragon that if you cut the head, 500 more tiny heads are springing up, and we all like all those kind of metaphors of like the bottom up and the grassroots movement being really grassroots and growing from underneath the concrete. But you're right, Marcia, that we have to be realists. But at the same time, I observed that in Poland there is a lot of those initiatives also about grant schemes, to create grant schemes for feminist, queer, grassroots organizing, to support it. They are obviously, in terms of budgets, incomparable to the money at the disposal of the right-wingers, but it still gives some hope. And maybe, Justin, I would like to follow up on this, or anything else that you would like to.
Yeah, I mean, maybe somehow it will be related, maybe not. But I mean, some idea came to my mind when I was listening to Hadley and Maria, because they were both talking about allies between different movements, maybe different social groups. Maria was talking about intersectional activism or intersectional approach to queer movement. And when I was listening to Hadley at the beginning, I mean, like maybe, I don't know, 20 minutes ago, you were saying about, that you can hear in this nationalistic fascist discourse that we need to protect our children. And by doing that, we, of course, protect the nation, the family, and so on. And this is something that, somehow is, I mean, for me, and let me explain something. I mean, right now I'm doing research on drug use in Poland. And when I was reading the transcripts from like the parliamentary discussion from the 90s, because back then a very harsh anti-drug law was introduced. So there were, many discussions what approach the Poland should take, whether it should be more liberal, whether it should be more like a drug-free approach, and so on. I mean, the same hero, I mean, like the same echo about children and about, the need of protection, this, very important nation in Europe, which is Poland, and protecting children by criminalizing drug use, by criminalizing drug possession, and so on. Because, I mean, why I'm talking about this, I'm thinking about, maybe the need of like unexpected alliances, that we should think not only in terms of like, LGBT community or feminist community, but also like about different social groups that are out there. And I think that we can observe something like this in Poland when we think about, for example, sex workers community, or sex workers self-organizing groups, which are very much in touch, at least with some feminist organization and with some queer organizations. I think that this is something very, very, very interesting. And I think that, I mean, it doesn't mean that it didn't happen in the past, but I think that now it's getting maybe more stronger, more visible at the same time, that we can talk, like, for example, I don't know, in media, that we can talk about LGBT issue, and at the same time we can talk about sex workers' rights, for example, or maybe even about rights of people who use drugs. This is something that for me will be also intersectional activism, so like to, connect different groups that are basically discriminated by the state, maybe in different way, but, they are very much in the same very, this is the difficult word, vulnerable position. Thank you.
Yes, exactly. Thank you so much. And there is this, we're talking about two very particular contexts that are at the same time very linked. So Poland and Hungary have this, weird nationalistic connection. There's this saying that everybody always says to you when you're Polish and Hungary or Hungarian in Poland, you know, Polish, Lengyel, Magyar, Ketio, Borat, or the Polak, Węgiel, dwa bratanki. So the Pole and the Hungarian are two brothers. It's a patriarchal and weird and nationalistic at the same time. But they kind of stick to it, you know, like it's, there is very deep collaborations on the right wing between those countries. There's like mutual inspiration in those laws. As Maria noticed, that there are basically templates that are circulating, and they agree on so many things. There has been a couple of years ago, the World Congress of Families was held in Budapest, and in the parliament hosted by the government, and there was a lot of speakers and attendees from Poland, of course, and they were discussing the master plan of protecting the family already back then and much earlier. But I wonder, what do you see the same things happening with queer activists, with Polish and Hungarian queer activists? Is there any forms of collaboration that you know of? Or if not, can you imagine them? I know it's a difficult question. I will leave it open. Oh, Dori, perfect. Go ahead.
I don't see much of this happening. And I think it's mainly a question of resources, and also being focused on local happenings. So you just don't really have enough attention left for, you know, Polish activism or any other activism, because so much is happening. And even though we have similar contexts in some sense, maybe, you know, there are some different local issues to respond, and you always immediately have to respond to everything. And so there are connections, and some organizations are more connected than others. For example, I know that Budapest Pride is quite connected to other Pride organizations. We in Labris, we have, I mean, we just know some Polish groups and people, but we don't regularly collaborate with anyone, because we just don't have the time. So so there's not much going on. Would be good, but it's just really beyond, I think, beyond us in energy and everything.
Hadley?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is less than certainly we would desire, all of us, I think. And that is, I think, often for material reasons. I think, you know, something that I have seen throughout my years kind of working with Hungarian activists is that, you know, they don't have a lot of financial support. There's not very much money. People have to work side jobs. There are very, very, very few activists who are salaried, are supported by funding. Everyone has a job. And so the amount of energy people have to devote to activism is limited. And of course, this becomes more of a pressure as everyone is under greater economic strain. And one of the sort of subtler, Justina, you were talking about these side unnoticeable politics, or effects on this. One of the subtler effects of Fidesz's politics has been to economically destroy the country, which has of course lined the pockets of the party politicians, but it has also had the effect of making everyone under greater economic pressure and therefore less able to organize and resist, right? Classic. I think it's also, as you were saying, Mariana, it's really one of the great lies of nationalism is that it's kind of an indigenous, domestic, national phenomenon. Nationalism has always been an incredibly transnational thing. And this modern form of hetero, reproductive, etc. nationalism is super transnational, right? I mean, we know from the late 90s and early 2000s already Polish anti-gay activists were using US Christian right anti-gay pamphlets and just translating them and adopting them. And now we have groups like the World Congress of Families coming to Budapest, etc. And of course, the World Congress of Families is this very well-funded international Christian right organization, which is specifically dedicated to working against queer people and feminists and non-traditional forms of life. So, you know, all of these connections are there, as are these legal connections with Hungary using these templates, with Poland using these templates. I should probably just stop there so we can move on.
Yes. Maria or Justyna, would you like to add something?
I can just add that when I was studying in Budapest at CEU, I saw a store named Ustawka, which is the Polish word for a fight between football fans, between two groups of football fans meet in a forest to fight. This is Ustawka, and this was a football fan store in Budapest. This was the name. Something, but it's a special word. It's specifically for football fans. But answering to Haley, so there are many connections between those right-wing guys and football fans and nationalists and fascists who are visiting Polish nationalist marches on the 11th of November, and there are Polish nationalists going to Budapest to participate in some neo-Nazi marches there. But yeah, I don't think there's much. Well, I agree there isn't much cooperation between LGBT organizations, and I think CEU used to be this kind of platform where we could meet, right? And maybe there wasn't much like activism and planning of common actions, but there was this very lively exchange, right? And you could just network. And I think with the move of CEU to Vienna, we have lost a very important connection to the LGBT movement in Hungary.
If I can, that's exactly what I was going to say. I think, again, unrecognized effects of a law like that is they got that international nexus of gender activists, queer activists, civil society activists out of the region. Poof. So, sorry, Justyna.
And at the same time, they created the Collegium Intermarium, which is a very bizarre anti-CEU, as I like to call it. Justyna, give your.
Yeah, very shortly, because I totally agree with you with all of these reflections, but at the same time, I'm thinking about like at least Polish queer movements, one could say, in a maybe longer historical perspective. When I was doing interviews with activists all around Poland, I noticed that they actually didn't speak that often about any organizations from the Central Eastern Europe. They were talking a lot about cooperation with Western countries and Western organizations. And this is something very interesting, and it tells us a lot about the region, that because of the EU, because of the accession, because also being somehow, just one step behind, this narrative, about being one step behind and so on, that this is something that probably, and also because of the money, right? That money were coming from the Western countries, at least in the 90s, at the beginning of the 20s and so on. This is something that maybe resulted in the fact that we do not actually cooperate that much in the region, right? I know that there was some project between Polish NGOs and NGOs in Ukraine, but they were usually like, bringing good practices from Poland to Ukraine. So maybe they were a bit problematic. Maybe some of them at least. Yeah.
Marisha has an immediate response.
Yes, I do, because you're right, Justina, but I think the causal relation goes the other way around. We don't cooperate within the region because there is a very strong mediator for all those NGO initiatives and funding and the know-how and the good practices and everything. So it's not really easy to cooperate outside of it unless you're really very underground, radical, queer collective doing, then you have the network of squads and anarchist collectives, right? But when you're not doing things under the radar, but you want funding, you want an office, you want more visibility or something, it's like a natural, like the structure, the field is structured like this, right? It's very difficult to cooperate there, like directly. There is always this mediator in the form of Western funding agencies and so on.
So if any funders are listening to us, it is time to restructure your priorities and put more focus on the collaborations within the Eastern European region, because that is what we need. So please do listen to us right now. I think there are some glimmers of hope. So for example, in Poland, Maria mentioned that there was, for example, this initiative in Warsaw already of funding a intervention hostel for LGBT persons, and not only. And then there were more of these hostels also coming up in other cities. In Poznań, there's one in Wrocław, I think other cities as well. And I know that there are some talks in Budapest to also start something like that. And hopefully it will be, we can also learn from each other what worked and what didn't work. If, like it started a bit earlier in Poland, although in Budapest, the talks about a hostel like that for homeless LGBT persons have been ongoing for many years, if I remember. But yes, let's hope that there is some brighter future. And since we have still some time, I will turn it to the audience. And we have 2 questions that I will read to you. And everyone else, please write your comments still on Facebook. We still have some time to answer. So first one is from Dennis, who is asking if there are any concerns about the recent Hungarian law requiring the documents of foreigners to be scanned and given to the police, as that relates to the surveillance of LGBTQ foreigners. Would Dori or Hadley care to comment on that?
To be honest, it's not, I haven't heard about this. If this happened in the past 3 weeks, then I was on holiday and tried not to read news. So it's like you go away for a week and then something happens and you miss. So it's like this. It's really like, oh, there's always something. So if it's that recent, then I don't know about this. If it's not as recent, I don't think that it created any discussions so far, so I can't answer. I'm sorry. Hadley, do you know anything about this?
No, I haven't heard about this either. The person asking the question says recent. Perhaps they could, throw out another note to let us know how recent, just maybe so we have a sense.
Yeah, maybe it actually relates to the pandemic situation, because in Hungary you get a card that is a proof of vaccination with a QR code that allows you to enter places, and maybe for foreigners who don't have that card, they need to scan their documents for some reason.
Yeah, could be. On the other hand, so it doesn't sound like either of us has actually heard anything about, this is a particular kind of like community or movement concern. On the other hand, in conjunction with COVID and the pandemic, there have been, many more, what's the word I'm looking for? Openings to increase surveillance of all sorts, at borders and elsewhere. And I think, that strikes me as a general concern. It's not clear necessarily how the kind of documents that, as far as I know, most border police, most, people are, in that situation are able to acquire from you, how that would indicate sexuality. But I did just, this is definitely kind of a spreading concern in an increasingly surveillance global world. And I did just read an article about how the Los Angeles police have been basically given a mission to collect all social media data from anybody they stop for any reason whatsoever. And maybe I'm just one of, sort of a lefty paranoid, but I could see that spreading. And if people are collecting your social media, they might have ways to find out if you're a queer person or something else. And then it becomes, I think, a question of, at what point does information like that become kind of meaningful, right? When do they does someone decide to act on it? And, the example that comes to mind just historically is knowing that, the socialist state in Hungary, many other socialist states, and the early post-socialist state, the police had what were known as pink lists, and they just kind of kept them. And most of the time they didn't use them for anything, but they always could, right? And at certain points they kind of did target people. So, as a potential, I think, that's really concerning to me, but at the moment, as far as I know, it's mostly a potential.
Yes, thank you. And then there's another question directed to Justina and Maria. And Agata is asking about your reflections on the emerging transphobia on the left and within some of the feminist circles, because that has been something that we have been observing for some time too.
Well, maybe somehow it's hard to comment, because I think that transphobia is not part of feminism, right? So this is like, at least, this is how I see it. And especially after the statement of Judith Butler's, part of the interview, the famous interview that was actually published. This is something that for me, I cannot, honestly, I cannot deal with it, because this is something that I don't understand. I believe that transphobia was probably always somewhere there, of course, within the feminism. But actually, when you think, about all these groups around TERF that I right now organize, especially in social media, attacking trans and non-binary people. This is something that I wouldn't expect. Maybe because of the fact that, when I was doing my research, and maybe it was a bit naive, and maybe we were wrong at that time. 10 years ago, when Anna Grodzka, she was like the first openly trans person in Polish parliament. I remember that back then we had this, discussions among queer activists, but also researchers, and we were talking, this is so great that, trans women become so visible, so important. Maybe it was like a false hope that, basically there is no transphobia. Maybe there, of course, definitely there were transphobia, but we did not pay too much attention to that. I don't know. This is something that I still need to sleep with, I think. With the topic. Yeah. Maria?
Yeah, so I had the same those same thoughts 10 years ago when Grodzka was elected. And I thought, wow, when there was a very strong transphobic reaction in America in the 70s, and that's when the word TERF was coined, the term TERF. And I was like, wow, there's nothing like this in Poland. We are in some other place, and we are things are going very differently. And she's immediately accepted as part of the feminist movement, right? And I think the current transphobia first is fueled by global transphobic discourse, because it all came from the West, you know. Both the anti-gender campaigns and the transphobia in feminism came here from the West. Like J.K. Rowling was the first victim of trans persons, demanding dignity, and it was, those arguments circulated on the internet and were picked up by persons to fight their particular causes in this particular moment when there is a very strong queer movement. The whole LGBT mobilization last year was sparked by a non-binary person, and there was a very strong queer presence during the protests against the abortion ban, and there was a strong demand that it is recognized that not only women need abortions, that the group women and the group people who might need abortions are two different, they overlap but are not identical, right? Because there are women who don't need abortions because they have no uteruses, and there are non-women who might need abortions. And this is something that caused this reaction, but I don't really know what political cause they are pursuing, because I really don't see what good might come of it, obviously it's the old politics of respectability and acceptability and assimilation, but I think in the present climate, present political climate, it doesn't work. It's a bad strategy, I think. That's my comment.
Thank you. Well, let's hope that as a non-endemic problem, it will also not travel too well, although maybe those are, yeah. All right. We have still time for some questions or some reflections. Hadley?
Yeah, I just wanted to respond to the sort of further information about this first question about the surveillance. So thank you for sending a link to this article. I guess Dori and I will both take a look at it, but it's not something I knew about really. It does sound potentially troubling, but again, it's not something that it's from this link that was sent. It seems like it's something that's emerging in the migration refugee situation, and then potentially spreadable from that. So it's not something that I've heard of anyone talking about in kind of the queer community. Doesn't mean people aren't, of course, but I haven't heard it.
All right. Any last words, anyone? Or, well, I think that concludes the meeting. Justyna, go ahead.
My last thought is that we should definitely organize such meetings more often to learn also about each other, more about our countries, because I think that, we all read about Hungary and probably researchers, activists learn a lot. Read a lot about Poland, but still, to discuss deep down what is going on there would be awesome. So, and thank you for organizing this meeting. It was amazing. Yeah.
Yes, agreed. This is one of these things that brings people together. We should do more. I totally agree.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah,
and thank you for organizing this Pracownia Etnograficzna.
Yeah, thank you.
So many thanks to all our guests and for this fantastic conversation, and to Pracownia Etnograficzna and the Duży Pokój Gallery for organizing this discussion. Thank you to all of you who have been listening and sending us comments, and hopefully see you next time on another iteration of this kind of event. Thank you.